Martin's talked a bit about the story so far, and we're now at a crucial stage in the negotiations, and it's at this point, as the Minister was saying earlier, that we're coming out to consultation on what we think and expect will be the key themes of the reform package when they're finally agreed. Budget deal needed first, and then some quite complex further agreements on specific areas of the regulations, but the Irish Presidency are very organised and focused, and I think if we can get a budget deal, we can have a reasonably high level of confidence that we'll get an agreement on the regulations themselves. I'm going to touch on a handful of the key elements of the reform package, but all the detail is in here, and we're trying to seek views as part of this very open conversation that the Minister was talking about to help us inform not only how we implement the reform arrangements in Wales, but also as we go through the process of the next few months, how we can help inform discussions at UK level, give Martin and his colleagues advice and the best sense forward in terms of what we're looking for here in Wales. In terms of the preparation work that's gone into this, we've had modelling groups looking at various technical aspects under the regulation of the draft regulations, and some of the modelling groups' work is contained here in this document. We've had a high-level group on CAP issues feeding in to early discussions and continuing the conversation around elements for the farming unions, but also other interests in this CAP reform process. And we've had Peter Davis's independent advisory group informing our work on the RDP. I'm going to concentrate mainly on the Pillar 1 stuff, but I will just touch on the RDP in a minute. Alec, can we have the next slide? Thank you. Subject to all the budget discussions that Martin was talking about, the single biggest element, of course, of this new direct payments regime is going to be called the basic payments system, accounting for about 70% of the total money available. Now, England, across the border, has gone through a transitional process to move towards an area base for those payments. As Martin says, that's something we've got to go through here in Wales and move away from historic entitlements towards this area approach. And we have a range of options, or we're likely to have a range of options about how we do that. And the modelling group at technical level has been looking at the various impacts. The Minister's very clear, he wants an environment in which farm businesses can plan for the future. How you tweak those payment rates in relation to geography or administrative boundaries will clearly have an impact on the amounts of money people are going to receive and can have disproportionate impacts on different kinds of businesses. And broadly speaking, if you're moving towards an area-based payment, you are likely to have the greatest impact on intensive and semi-intensive enterprises where land area tends to be less and where in the past they've had higher historic entitlements. And that may be penalising the very enterprises which are the most dynamic, potentially the most competitive for the future. So there are a range of policy issues that we need to try and address, and the consultation exercise sets out some of the ratios that apply between different rates and the impacts those might have, and what the options might be to us in terms of how we set the rates in future. But it is a zero-sum game. Okay, we have a finite amount of money, or we will have a finite amount of money once the budget negotiations are agreed at EU level and then at UK level, and it's how we divide that total up in terms of the basic payments. There's also the transition period. How far or how long is it going to take to get to that point? The Commission are quite keen on sticking to the financial frameworks. In other words, they don't really like laws or regulations pushing beyond each 7-year financial period. On the other hand, we have argued that there should be a bit more flexibility to allow a longer timescale, and of course much of that depends on the nature of the payment rate system that we go for at the end of the day, because if there are sharper differential impacts, you might want longer to bring those in. If we can agree on something which more or less minimises the adjustments for farm enterprises, it might be that the transition period can be shorter. That again is something for discussion. And then the rate at which that happens, so how much is historic entitlement and how much is the area basis, and at what point do those shift so it goes the other way, that's also for discussion, and we're pressing for as much discretion on that at regional level. And in European context, as Martin was just saying, Wales qualifies as a region. We're looking for as much discretion around that to set those step changes in the process as we can, and therefore we'll hopefully pick an arrangement which suits us best here. Moving on to the next slide very briefly, the right to claim, who comes to the party, as Martin was just saying, is going to be pretty key. What are the entitlement arrangements that are going to apply? We think there's going to be a national reserve, principally aimed at new entrants to farming, but will it be this complicated arrangement around what you were doing in 2011, rolled forward to 2014? We don't know yet. And of course, Martin is battling away at UK level with our full support on coming up with a system which is implementable, because you can have all sorts of complexity added into negotiations, particularly at a late stage in a process, to buy off different elements of concern around the negotiating table. If that leaves you with an unimplementable reform, we've got big problems. And we know what the risks are around disallowance, that's clawback of money by the Commission if we get it wrong, and we shouldn't be designing a system up front which is going to lead almost inexorably to those sorts of problems. So there's a lot of work still to be done there. There's also a debate as to what will qualify as an active farmer in future. Commissioner Cholos is quite clear, and I think he's right, that this is not about subsidising enterprises that aren't really involved in active farming at all. And the classic one that is rolled out, certainly was in 2004-05 when I was working in England, was the golf course scenario. If you go to an area-based payment, golf courses could potentially qualify in terms of grass area. Is that right? There have been a number of moves as to what might constitute the rules around active farming. At the moment, or it looks as if the latest view is that there will be a negative list, certain things that don't qualify, and that's probably okay, but we'll need to look hard at that, I think, and make sure from our perspective that it is about activities rather than anything else that will allow us to target payment to the right people. Over on to the next slide. The other main component then of the direct payment is going to be the greening element, at least that's as we understand it, at 30% of the total payment. Now the Parliament is arguing, that second point there, that that might be completely separate from the basic payment, and that you could just have the basic payment and not worry about the greening element. Strikes me as a bit odd. I'm not sure that Council will be terribly keen on that. I don't think Commissioner Cholos will be terribly keen, but that's still a negotiation that needs to be played out. Martin's already touched on some of the things that would qualify towards greening in terms of the ecological focus area, how much of an enterprise or a farm business would have to be devoted to key environmental outcomes through an EFA, an ecological focus area. Permanent grassland will work as a qualifying measure in Wales particularly. Most of our smaller farms already qualify under the current definition of permanent grassland. Some of our, or quite a lot of our larger enterprises do as well. But the precise terms of what qualifies for permanent grassland and does that have real environmental quality is still something that's going to be taken through or forward in the negotiations process. Martin touched on crop diversification, Natura 2000 areas, and at the moment organic farms would all qualify for this greening component. Later additions, moving on, Aled, are around the agri-environment schemes and this notion of green by equivalence, and also in relation to environmental certification schemes. Now there are potentially all sorts of things that could go into that. Nutrient management, energy-related requirements. There's a lot of work to be done around there in terms of what might qualify. But the agri-environment stuff is certainly welcome in relation to glass tier, some of the other work that's been going on already. But as Martin has touched on, there then potentially becomes an issue around double funding. The Parliament has said, as far as we're concerned, we're quite relaxed about the notion of farmers getting paid twice for these sorts of outcomes. The Commission will not be keen on that, and even if the Commission thought they might get away with it, which I think is highly unlikely, the European Court of Auditors would almost certainly come in behind them and make that job very difficult. So we just need to watch that and how that particular bit of the debate plays out. Touched on young entrants. Commissioner Cholos again is very keen to have much more emphasis on support for young farmers and has proposed elements of the direct payment that would go in precisely to supporting young entrants. As you see there, a sort of top slice from direct payments. There's also, of course, provision to do this sort of activity under the second pillar, the RDP. And in Wales, we have our own pretty successful young entrant support scheme, yes. So there are a range of issues for us in Wales to think about as to how we move forward. I suppose the one point I would make is it all about young entrants or is it about new entrants? So is it a yes scheme for the future or a NES, new entrant support scheme for the future? That I think is something where again we would welcome your views. Speaking of somebody who is over 40 and therefore wouldn't qualify for a young entrant designation, at least on current form. There are plenty of people who can bring in new experience into farming and add value to the mix, and should potentially be entitled to do that. So I think this is an area which we need to look at further. I think at European level, people have been open to the notion of exploring that issue further. The RDP, of course, might provide more flexibility around the support that we provide in Pillar 1. That will depend a bit on how the regulations come out in the Welsh. Let me then touch on some RDP stuff for a moment, for the next slide. Just touching on here points that Terry wanted to bring to your attention in terms of the farming competitiveness agenda particularly, and how the RDP supports Pillar 1, the direct payments. And the Minister's been very clear that although these consultations are running sort of side by side, and we're trying to link as much as we can the socio-economic, the business support, community support elements of the RDP with the other structural funds, for which, in organisational terms, I am also responsible within the Welsh Government Service, and try and get the synergies and the linking ups and the dovetailing of those funds so we make maximum use of available investment support. Nevertheless, the RDP is an integral part of the Common Agricultural Policy, and we want to use the RDP in a way which will support the general thrust of reforms, including those set out under the direct payments regime. So there are things we can do around farm advisory work, Farming Connect, the point of you being here today to talk about the important work that goes on through Farming Connect in support of businesses, on-farm investments, primary processing, and then working with those other structural funds perhaps into processing further down the supply chain, activity to support our obligations and our aspirations as well under various elements of environmental regulation at European Union level, particularly biodiversity and habitats directives, there are a number of others as well, the Water Framework Directive. And then woodland and forestry is a feature too. The menu, the palette that will be available to us under the RDP is likely to be a bit more flexible than we've got in the current arrangements, but with increased focus on competitiveness and on renewable energy and tackling climate problems, and also on the public goods that come from agri-environment schemes. So, last slide for me then. Next steps. Martin's talked about the hope that we can get a deal on the multi-annual financial framework, the budget. Like Martin, what we've picked up through our direct contacts in Brussels and in Strasbourg is that there's a little less certainty about a deal coming off in the next few days, although by and large people are optimistic. It's important if we can get this process out of the way well before the German elections get underway, because that would really complicate matters, push things further back. We need the budget deal to unlock all the other elements of this reform process, and indeed work on elsewhere the structural funds, and also on the fisheries reform process. We will then know from the Commission what the transitional measures are for 2014, which will take us through to that new implementation date, which we think will come off of the 1st of January 2015. That's what the Commission are now proposing. This consultation process, and I do very much support the Minister's comments about inviting you to pitch in and get your views in to us, is about looking at those key elements, both of Pillar 1, direct payments, and Pillar 2, the RDP, and how they interact, and also how they react or interact with the other bits of the European investment funding available to us, so that we can shape the reform discussions, not just at EU and UK level as we go through the reform process over the next few months, but also that we get the implementation as right as we can for Wales and the challenges and opportunities that we face here. Thank you for listening to me, and I'll come and join the panel now for Q&A.
Thank you very much.